Good evening, everyone. Hi, thank you, and thank you for showing up, and welcome to Capital of the Palestinian Diaspora, the story of Yarmouk. This event is made possible by collaboration of the Syrian American Council Houston chapter and Students for Justice in Palestine at the University of Houston. We came together to work to raise awareness on the shared plight of Syrians and Palestinians in Yarmouk and in all of Syria. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of showing up and why we show up. So tonight in Houston, as terrible weather, thunderstorms, as a result, the traffic was congested, the highways were terrible. It's kind of a nightmare driving. It's Friday night at University of Houston, which we all know most people want to be at home, and there's a major event going on across the hall. So why are you guys here tonight? Anyone want to offer what made them come?
Before I answer, I want to add to what you said. The University of Houston should really work on their science, because it's really hard to find your way around. Anyways, thank you very much for hosting this event. I'm here because I've heard a lot about Yarmouk. We've been hearing a lot about Syria in the past 4 years. But Yarmouk in particular forms a very special case and specific case because it's a complicated case. It involves Palestinians who already fled their homes because of things going around in their home country. And then they're here for refugees. So involving them in such a very complicated conflict makes their position also very complicated. So I came because I want to hear from people like you about how is this situation, why is this situation complicated, and how can the public help? Not in politics, but in other ways. And I'm sure there are other ways that people can, even if they're contributing somehow, a little bit, it's going to make a difference. So, thank you very much.
Okay. Yes?
I guess I'm here because I also want to understand how Yarmouk, the situation is so bad, considering it's right so close to Damascus. It boggles my mind that it can be so close to a big city and have such a dire humanitarian situation. And also I feel that we have really privileged lives, and anything that we do is so minuscule in the face of the humanitarian need. And so it's almost a duty to raise awareness, to do anything that we can to help.
And I'm here personally just to hear the word Yarmouk, hear the name Yarmouk, because you don't hear that from people most of the time. So it's nice to actually hear about it rather than just reading about it in a very shallow way in the mainstream narrative. So I want to just hear it.
So I'm hearing people came out here tonight to support Palestinians and the Palestinian history and the Palestinian cause. However, in all the ways that it manifests today, people have come out here because they have a sense that we live in America and we have a sense of privilege. Yarmouk is right next to Damascus. How can, that's such a stark juxtaposition. And also, in today's age, there's a lot of articles that are written. They might be in echo chambers. I think that's a fair statement to say, and so we're out here tonight to also speak about what's happening. I want to share with you guys why I show up for Syria. I'm Syrian American, and I show up because I show up for my family. I also show up for people who I don't know. I show up for the stories that I'll probably never know, because it's the stories that it is often the worst stories that stay in the shadows. So with that in mind, there's a sense of urgency in what's happening in Syria, and that's why I show up. But that's actually only the second reason why I show up. The first reason why I show up for Syria is because while we often talk about Syria in terms of people who have died, there are many more people who are still alive, who are survivors of violence. And to honor their fight for life, I want to fight alongside them, and that's why I keep showing up. So Talal is a Palestinian American writer in Brooklyn. He works with activists, he works with people in Yarmouk to document what's happening over there, to take their stories and put them up on media platforms here in the West. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Talal.
have a question for you guys as well. Who here is Palestinian or involved in some capacity in pro-Palestinian work or activism or? Okay, good, very important. So we heard from two different people here that the situation in Yarmouk is completely veiled in complexities, in mystery, in myth. And it's extremely difficult to discern what is myth and what isn't. The fact of the matter is, as many of you would either be eager to acknowledge or hesitant to acknowledge, that a lot of things are going on in Syria. In my viewpoint, it is both a proxy war, it has sectarian elements, and at the same time it is and remains a popular uprising. And it's essential to remember throughout all of this that those three things can and often do exist concurrently in the Middle East. Now, the way I've kind of organized this is, since I don't have a great understanding of how much you guys know about Yarmouk, I'm going to begin by discussing the camp and then cataloging the events from the beginning of the uprisings up until the present that happened within Yarmouk. Now, a common thing that happens with Yarmouk and anything in Syria is if someone speaks about it and someone in the audience disagrees politically, they impugn his account. So anything I say that you have some issue with or that there's some uncertainty about, I encourage you to reach out to me to verify sources, or I will gladly put you in touch with people that are inside the camp currently who you can still communicate with and form your own understanding about the camp based on that. The fact of the matter is that Yarmouk has less to do, or lack of understanding about Yarmouk has less to do with the fact that it's in the middle of a war zone, it is the center of a war zone currently, and more to do with the fact that the effort from us, myself included, even with the work that I do, has lacked to a very great degree. We mourn for the fact that this camp has been destroyed. We throw our hands in the air and say, oh, this is terrible, as is the entirety of Syria, but we refuse to seriously engage with what's going on. Yarmouk was the largest Palestinian camp in Syria. More important than its size, it was referred to, as is the headline of this talk, the capital of the Palestinian Diaspora. Now I want everyone here to take a second and try to fathom what that means. There are Palestinian communities throughout the world in diaspora, doing great work. Even here in the US, we see the fantastic achievements that have been made by SJP, by some of the BDS movement and its advocates within the US. And still, despite this, despite the great Palestinian communities in Lebanon and elsewhere, it was referred to as the capital of the Palestinian diaspora. Why is this? It's because Yarmouk was, and in my opinion continues till today, to be the center of the intellectual, political, and cultural life of Palestinians in the diaspora. Now here's a very important thing that you want to keep in mind throughout all of this. Often, when people talk about Palestinians in Syria, they say, well, Palestinians in Syria had it better than Palestinians anywhere else. And often, this is used as a manner to defend Bashar al-Assad. To say, look how well he treated Palestinians. Well, hopefully I'm not the first, and also hopefully I'm not the last to say that just because someone didn't treat us as terribly as the Lebanese government and other places, doesn't mean that we owe our allegiances to anyone, especially when they are in the middle of a massacre. We don't owe anyone anything. The second point I want to make before I delve into this is more and more you're hearing Zionists use Yarmouk as a talking point. They say, why aren't you guys talking about Yarmouk? You know what, I have the same issue. We aren't talking about Yarmouk enough. But the essential fact that Palestinians wouldn't be in Syria if it wasn't for the creation and the continued destruction of Palestinian life in Israel will never be forgotten by us, and we should always insist upon it. Now, prior to the conflict, as I was saying, culturally, politically, intellectually, Yarmouk was a center. There was leeway for Palestinians within Yarmouk. They were allowed to engage politically in a way that they aren't in Lebanon. All Palestinian factions were represented in one way or another within Yarmouk. And although there were still the limitations that all Syrians faced within Syria, the extreme repression of the Assad dynasty, Palestinians in Yarmouk were allowed to discuss Palestine, albeit abstractly. Now, when the events began, everyone has always been curious about what was the position of Palestinians. Let me be the first to tell you that there was not necessarily a consensus of Palestinian opinion. I'm not going to stand here and to enhance my points, tell you that all Palestinians in Syria stood up against Bashar al-Assad. No, as I'll talk about later on in the talk, the people enforcing the siege of Yarmouk are Palestinians. This is a very complicated situation, but at the same time, from a moral standpoint, it is not so complicated. And anyone who tries to conflate the two things is engaging in moral, intellectual, and political cowardice. When the events came to be, Palestinian civil society, activists on the ground, political factions got together, and they said, well, what are we going to do? We find ourselves as Palestinians in the middle of another conflict zone. Historically, we know that Palestinians, wherever there is conflict, are always at the receiving end of some kind of brutality, regardless of where it is, whether it's Libya, Iraq, Lebanon. Some massacre is almost always imposed upon us. Keeping this in mind, Palestinians decided from the beginning, formally, to maintain some kind of neutrality about this. That being said, again, as with everything with Yarmouk and with Syria, there's more to the story than just this. Young activists, people within the camp, civil society leaders, very reluctantly accepted this neutrality. And eventually the concession was made that they would be allowed to engage in some pro-revolutionary work as long as it wasn't overt. And so they did. Little known fact, when the revolution became armed, Palestinians in Yarmouk helped smuggle weapons to the armed revolution. Little known fact, before the opposition stepped 1 foot inside the camp, there were huge protests within Yarmouk calling for the downfall of Bashar al-Assad. There are a series of events that I want to highlight to give you some kind of semblance of an idea of what life was like in Yarmouk prior to the siege. The first is in 2011 during the Nakba protests. Now, for those of you that follow the news in the Middle East, you recall that Palestinians and others in Lebanon and Syria and other places went down to the Israeli borders to protest, and even got through in some cases. An aside, again, to add to the already complex situation. Palestinians and Syrians in general were never allowed anywhere near the Israeli border, as a general rule. Never. This year, in the middle of the turmoil, Bashar al-Assad decided to do what the Syrian regime has done for quite a while. To use Palestinians as a prop in their propaganda and to distract away from the brutal repression that was going on during the beginning of the uprising. Palestinians not only were allowed in masses to go to the border, they were encouraged. Buses were arranged to take them to the border to protest. Now, during this protest, a handful of Palestinians got killed, but the Israelis were caught off guard, and so it wasn't as brutal as it could have been. But already, the neutrality was shaken. Palestinians saw that some of their brothers, while out protesting, were being killed and shot at by Israelis, and the Syrian regime, the self-proclaimed vanguard of Palestinian resistance, was watching. Although the resentment began to bubble, although activists within the camp were already working in coordination with Syrian activists, anti-regime activists, it still wasn't as blatant as it would become. The Nakba Day protest, same year, 2011 in the summer. The same thing reoccurs. This time the Israelis are ready. Dozens of Palestinians are killed in plain sight of Syrian soldiers. The Syrian soldiers do absolutely nothing. For the first time, you hear Palestinian slogans in large groups against the Syrian regime. Wahed, Nen, Jesh Suri Wen. 1, 2, where's the Syrian army? After the dozens are killed, Palestinians return to Yarmouk, and for the first time, there is a large anti-regime protest in the summer of 2011 against the regime. It began as a funeral, transformed into a demonstration, and large groups of Palestinians went around the camp chanting for the regime to fall. Eventually, they end up at the headquarters of a very important actor in the entire crisis of Yarmouk. The headquarters of the Palestinian faction, the PFLP-GC. I'm going to refer to them as the General Command. The General Command is a breakaway group of the PFLP. They are led by a man named Ahmad Jibril, widely considered throughout the camp, even by those who oppose the revolution, as being nothing more than a proxy of the regime, an extension of the regime. They go to the headquarters and they chant against the PFLP-GC. They chant against Ahmad Jibril and they chant against the regime. And in response, Palestinians with the PFLP-GC shoot down at the protesters and in the process kill a teenage boy. The Palestinians respond by setting their headquarters on fire. Ahmed Jibril, the head of the PFLP-GC, has to be evacuated from Yarmouk before any oppositional force had stepped foot inside the camp by the Syrian army. I highlight this for a number of reasons, but most importantly, to say this. You hear from some segments of Palestinians and regime proponents that the PFLP-GC is representative of Palestinians and widely supported. If that's the case, then why did the leader of the PFLP-GC have to be evacuated by the Syrian army before any rebel had stepped foot in the camp for fear that Palestinians would burn him alive? At this point, the summer of 2011, oh excuse me, I drink some water. A series of demonstrations within the Yarmouk against the regime become a reoccurring factor within the camp. A reoccurring event. In response, the regime and its ally, the PFLP-GC, occupy essentially Yarmouk and begin to continuously raid Palestinian activist homes, arrest Palestinian activists, and hand them over to the regime to be put in regime prisons. This goes on until the winter of 2012, December of 2012. Everything I've just described to you, all the demonstrations, all the deaths, the arrests, the chants against the regime, all take place before a single FSA or any oppositional armed group steps foot inside Yarmouk. The attempt at neutrality within the camp was robbed first and foremost by the Syrian regime and its proxy ally, the PFLP-GC. That is a point that is constantly overlooked. Constantly overlooked. Now in December of 2012, the day before oppositional forces enter Yarmouk, the Syrian regime drops barrel bombs on it. Further evidence of the regime animosity towards the Palestinians, and further evidence of the fact that the sentiments within Yarmouk were largely sympathetic towards the revolution. This affinity between the Palestinian people in Syria and the Syrian people that were out protesting and getting killed has a long history, one that precedes the siege, one that precedes any armed opposition entering the camp. The next day after the barrel bombs, various oppositional groups enter the camp. They call Yarmouk the gateway to Damascus because of its location. Through Yarmouk, we will get to Damascus, they chant. And they enter. On that same day, a partial siege is imposed upon Yarmouk. Now, before I kind of discuss some of the further tragedies and despair that will visit Yarmouk, I want to make a point that's very important to me. Because often when I discuss these things, people say, well, you know what, the opposition did this too. Why are you overlooking that? And the fact of the matter is, I'm not. And neither are many other anti-Assad activists and writers and thinkers. The Syrian opposition groups that entered, among them, were two FSA segments that were brutal towards the Palestinians inside the camp. They were marauding thugs who robbed the hospital in Yarmouk, harassed them, beat up people, eclipsed the voices of anti-regime Palestinian voices within the camp. That being said, these two FSA segments were eventually driven out of Yarmouk. Not by the regime, not by the PFLP-GC, both of which had begun their siege on Yarmouk, but by other oppositional factions within the camp.
Who are they? Excuse me. Who are they? The two oppositional.
There were two FSA segments, different groups, that had entered.
That's oppositional to Assad.
Oppositional to Assad. They were kicked out by...
Which groups?
They were FSA groups, battalions. What's the confusion?
They belong to, for example, maybe a particular, like for example, particular group, for example, maybe you say they were to Tawhid or something like that within the FSA rank. Are they not split ideological groups? Okay.
Oh, the specific name of the battalions? If you want to email me afterwards, I can find them for you. I don't have that memorized. But they were kicked out by a collection of other oppositional groups, which included Ethnaf Bet al-Miqdis, which is the current Palestinian
The
opposition.
thing is, I want to understand, there is Nusra, there is all this
Let's save
things.
our questions till the end.
Okay.
Please.
No, it's just
I understand.
asked because he said if you were confused about anything, so I thought I can ask now.
No, that's fine. I understand the confusion. The FSA isn't one group. There's no one FSA. The FSA is composed of various semi-autonomous and sometimes completely autonomous battalions. When the entry into Yarmouk happened by oppositional forces, among them were different FSA groups that had nothing to do with each other, some Islamist groups, and the formation eventually of Aknaf Bet al-Mikdis, which is unofficially Hamas, also existed within the camp. All of these groups are semi-unrelated to each other and often fight with each other, but what they share in common is that they all oppose Assad. What I am trying to convey is that two of them were especially brutal towards Palestinians within the camp. They were kicked out of the camp by other oppositional forces. Again, it's important to keep in this framework that while the regime tends to be one group, you can combine them together and consider them a monolith. You can't do the same for the opposition. Even within the FSA, it is not one group. There is not one general who commands all of the FSA. They tend to be semi-autonomous or completely autonomous, distinct from one another, sharing only the value that they want to overthrow Assad. And among them, you'll find some that are corrupt and that harass people, as is the case with these two FSA battalions that I was mentioning. And among them, you'll find people who are very kind, very pleasant, very receptive to the will of the people of the area of which they come to control. So these two FSAs were kicked out. Now, additionally, when we want to discuss oppositional crimes within Yemen, up until recently, before ISIS had entered the camp, there were two oppositional forces within Yemen. There was Aknaf Bet al-Mikdis, which is unofficially Hamas, formed mostly of former Hamas members, Palestinian members, who opposed the regime, and there was Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra is Al-Qaeda in Syria. Now, to expand on my own commentary that the oppositional forces are not entirely without blame, Jabhat al-Nusra has harassed Palestinians within the camp. I wrote an article about this. In fact, there's a video somewhere online of Jabhat al-Nusra slaughtering two Palestinian activists on the streets of Yarmouk in plain daylight, in front of everyone. Now, again, I highlight that to say that, to return to a reoccurring theme in all of this, that you can acknowledge the sectarian element, that you can discuss oppositional crimes, that you can discuss the proxy element, the involvement of the Gulf, the involvement of the US. You can do all of these things without forfeiting the moral imperative, which is that an uprising against people, against the despot, should be supported. Go ahead.
Excuse me, I don't understand the sectarian element as it comes to Yarmouk.
Not specifically Yarmouk, but throughout Syria, I think it goes without saying that there are oppositional factions that are extraordinarily sectarian. But again, as I pointed out to the ladies, that there's no monolith, there's no one group. And so you will find aspects of the opposition that are sectarian, and you will find many that aren't. We return to Yarmouk. December 2012, partial siege begins to be imposed. Already life within the camp is tattered. Very little aid is allowed in. Very little medical resources. Very little food. Water is still running. Next year, summer of 2013, the partial siege transforms into a complete siege. No food is allowed inside. No medical resources are allowed inside. People are trapped inside. No one can leave, no one can come in. Of the Palestinians that tried to leave through the checkpoints set up by the PFL-PGC and the regime, many of them were kidnapped and disappeared into Assad regime prisons. This goes on up until the present day. There has been either a partial or complete siege of the Palestinian refugee camp and the some 20,000 Palestinians trapped within it for over 850 days. There hasn't been running water in Yarmouk for over 200 days. The only semi-functional hospital within Yarmouk was barrel bombed after ISIS invaded recently. Now, ISIS's invasion. ISIS enters Yarmouk, and these flamboyant barbarians thrust Yarmouk into the headlines. Suddenly, all these articles are coming out. Suddenly, people are like, well, what about our Palestinian brothers and sisters in Yarmouk? ISIS is comprised, I don't think I need to reiterate or emphasize to anyone, of barbarians. and they have already beheaded a handful of Palestinians within Yarmouk. They have already kidnapped scores of Palestinian men and women. They have already beaten Palestinian women on the streets of Yarmouk because they assumed that they had association with the Knafa Dignita's fighters. But the entirety of the deaths within Yarmouk since ISIS invaded the camp account to less than 2% of the entirety of Palestinian deaths in Syria since the beginning of this conflict. I want you to think about that for a second. Think about the coverage that Yarmouk has gotten since ISIS went in. Less than 2% of all Palestinian documented deaths in Syria have resulted from ISIS's invasion. And not entirely from ISIS invasion, by the way. Part of those deaths consist of Palestinian deaths from under the barrel bombs that have been falling almost daily from the Syrian regime. Now, a lot of people are curious about what's the situation now in Yarmouk. And I'm going to finish with this and then go on to some of the implications of this and our neglect of this. Currently, ISIS enters and then retreats from Yarmouk. The largest fighting oppositional group within the area of Yarmouk and adjacent neighboring areas that are also under siege is Jabhat al-Nusra. ISIS would not have entered Yarmouk without the complicity or tacit acceptance of Jabhat al-Nusra. That is a fact. Now, without delving into conspiracies, at a very minimum, we can point out that the current harassment of Palestinians and slaughter of Palestinians at the hands of ISIS in Yarmouk has a lot to do with Jabhat al-Nusra as well. And we cannot absolve them of blame. Now, I mentioned some statistics earlier, and let me just touch upon something and then return to the statistics. A lot of people ask, how did ISIS get into Yarmouk? It's kind of bewildering, right? There has been a siege on Yarmouk for all of these days, as we've been discussing. How could ISIS suddenly find itself there? Now, a lot of people point to the regime, and they say this is a regime conspiracy. And a lot of other people point to the opposite, and say that the entire opposition was always ISIS, and that's how it happened. The fact of the matter is, if we were paying attention to Yarmouk from the beginning, we'd know that ISIS has been in an area called Hajar al-Aswad for over a year. An area that is adjacent to Yarmouk. And in fact, they entered Yarmouk last March and did their little parade and took pictures with their flag and then retreated. This points to a larger issue with Yarmouk and Syria. It is our shortcoming if we don't understand things. And we should be honest with ourselves and with those that we discuss it with. The worst thing you can do is point to conspiracies. The worst thing you can do is throw your hands in the air and be like, oh, this is too complicated. How did this happen? Follow these events. Keep in touch with people in Yarmouk. Maintain your interest longer than Yarmouk when Yarmouk is thrust into the headlines. And things begin to clarify on their own. Now, I mentioned how less than 2% of Palestinians, of all Palestinian deaths, had resulted since ISIS invasion. Let me give you some more statistics. And again, I welcome any curiosities about their source and their validity. There are 2 Palestinian-Syrian human rights organizations operating within Syria now. And they both come to the same conclusion statistically. Over 2,800 Palestinians have been killed since the start of the Syrian uprising. Over 2,800 Palestinians have been killed since the start of the Syrian uprising. Now, I asked in the beginning of this talk, who here is active in pro-Palestine work? Who here is interested in it? It is bewildering to me, as it should be to all of you, the fact that over 2,800 Palestinians have died, and none of us are talking about this. None of us are discussing this. More alarming to me are the reasons often given. Syria it's too divisive. It's too divisive for our community. Yeah, the oppressive regime is bad, but if it falls, then crazy Islamists are going to take over. Both of these things, I appeal to the discerning members of the audience. Where have we heard these things before? This is too divisive. Who here has been in a divestment meeting recently? These are Zionist talking points. And the fact that we are recycling them is very alarming. More alarming still is the justification of the siege on Yarmouk. If the terrorists simply left the camp, then the siege would be over. Where have we heard this? Does anyone follow the blockade against Gaza? Have we not heard these same talking points before? I am happy to discuss oppositional crimes, and I think it is an imperative that we do underline them and discuss them and point them out. At the same time, returning to the statistics of over 2,800 documented Palestinian deaths, the overwhelming majority have been because of the Assad regime. And as much as we try to remove ourselves from the politics in Syria, this is a fact. This is a fact from two separate Palestinian human rights groups working within Syria. Some of these deaths are from bombings and shelling. That's eerie coincidence. Over a thousand from shelling and bombing, almost entirely from the regime. Over 176 as a direct result of the siege. You know how someone dies from a siege, from starvation? Have you seen the pictures? The person is transformed into a shell of their former self. They are reduced to a nothing. Their personality is evacuated. They are gone. They are vanished. 176 Palestinians have died from either starvation or malnutrition or some aspect related to the siege that has been imposed, I repeat, for over 860 days. Another manner in which Palestinians have been killed. And this one is dear to my heart, and I know dear to the heart of a lot of Palestinian Syrians I spoke with. The torture of Palestinians in Assad regime prisons. There is a man that everyone here should look up named Hassan. This man was a poet. He was an actor. He was an activist. My friend Nidal, who's from the camp, tells me this man was the future of Palestine. Period. You can watch his videos on YouTube. He is funny, and he is charming, and he is incredibly witty and clever and politically on point. And he died when he disappeared after trying to leave Yarmouk. And a handful of days later, his family were told to come pick up a death certificate. We thought that was the end of the story. We thought that was the end of the story until we found out that he had been identified in the Caesar photos that had been smuggled out of Syria. Over 370 Palestinians have been tortured to death. Think about that number for a second. Think about what it means to be tortured to death. Let me give you an example. This was told to me by someone who had been lucky enough to escape from the regime prison. He had told me, you know what's the best way to die in one of Assad's dungeons? The best way, best case scenario. Body sores. Your final moments spent when you are dying from body sores are in a delirium, a fevered delirium, where you look at your arm and you might find that meat from your hand simply falls off. That is not a dramatization. That is how it happens. That is the best case scenario if you are to die in an Assad prison. over 370 Palestinians have died in this manner. 800 are currently rotting in Assad jails. The way I kind of have and would hope to also end it in this instance, this conversation, is to talk about larger implications. A lot of us here are active in pro-Palestine work, right? Those of us least active at least put up pictures or Facebook statuses from time to time, and I don't judge anyone, we all do what we can. I have interviewed over 100 Palestinians from Syria. And I'm not special in any manner. You can, as I told you, reach them yourself. And I would gladly put any of you in touch with Palestinians in Yarmouk. Feel free to email me. The reoccurring sentiment I have heard expressed from people of various political backgrounds is a sense of betrayal and a sense of abandonment. They say, we see how Palestinians come out for Gaza in the West Bank when something is happening there. We ourselves come out and protest for them too. But who's coming out for Yarmouk? who's coming out and saying that there is a group of Palestinians who refused to be displaced for a second time and remained in Yarmouk. And what can I tell you? The fact is no one is. This is all of our shortcoming, and I'm not coming here from a place of moral indignation or some moral high horse. This is all of our shortcoming, collectively, myself included. I've heard from dozens of Palestinians that they're not even interested in right of return anymore. They say, all my friends are dead. All the people we used to go out and protest for the right of return with are dead. I'm going to go back by myself. They tell me, Talal, there are people who openly, in Palestinian spaces, say, we support Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad is the lesser of two evils. And we accommodate them. We let them come to our meetings. If someone says something anti-Semitic, we kick them to the door, as we should. But we're fine allowing someone to sit right next to us at a pro-Palestine meeting who endorses the death of over 2,300 Palestinians, who endorses the death of over 370 Palestinians who have died in Assad jails. I've always said our strongest weapon as Palestinians, or those of you involved in the Palestine war, it's not our weapons. It's not because we're politically suave. It is the endurance of our collectivity. It is the fact that even though we've been cast to all corners of the world, and even though I have no idea what it's like to be in Gaza right now, and even though you might not know anything about what it's like to be like in the West Bank, or what it's like to be a Palestinian in Lebanon during the Civil War, we always stand with our brothers and sisters. We never hesitate to say there is someone killing our people, at a minimum, even if there's nothing we can do besides say it. We stand out and we say, that person is killing our people. What we find with Yarmouk is relatively unprecedented, at least on this scale. It is a disruption of our collectivity in a manner that hasn't happened before, again, to this scale. I think, to our horror, we may one day come to find that our neglect of Yarmouk, our silence about it, our reluctance to point out its culprit, will one day author the final fragmentation of Palestinian collectivity. Thank you very much.
So, we have time for some questions and answers.
I have a question related to the humanitarian situation in Yarmouk.
I'm sorry, can you raise your voice?
I have a question about the humanitarian situation there. So can you talk a little bit about the infrastructure, the source of food and support and medical care and refuge? What's going on there, and how is UNRWA able to help, if at all? I mean, I think around this time last year, Chris Guinness, I think it was the first time he actually came out and said that the regime promised them safety, a safe convoy, and then abandoned them halfway to the camp at the entrance. And I don't know what UNRWA's position has been since then, or what has changed for them, and are they able to actually support them despite the siege?
I mean, they are partial. They've occasionally been permitted to bring in some aid. You'll see in some of these people eating out of this jar, there are sometimes lentils get in, and they put it in a huge vat of water. And then people get this watered down soup. But they're not the only source of aid entering Yarmouk. And this is, I think, essential for me, for people who are interested in the humanitarian aspect, how they can help. There is a local Palestinian charity called the Jafra Foundation, which does phenomenal work, better work than these UN agencies.
In Yarmouk or
in
Syria?
In Yarmouk. And in fact, they were able to get an aid to some of the adjacent areas where people had left that are still under siege after ISIS invaded. Now, of course, their resources are much more constrained than any UN agency. But on the flip side, there is more faith with that organization than there is with any UN agency.
Is it because they haven't really been straight about what's preventing them from entering? Because they've kind of tiptoed around the issue with what Assad has helped them with or what they haven't done for them, except for that one interview that I heard, I think, on Electronic Intifada around this time last year. But I don't know what they're really saying.
I mean, I can't really berate them or even the Jeffra Foundation for not having a strong political stance.
Right.
They're doing humanitarian work.
Humanitarian.
They have to go through the regime. There's no other option. But here's the difference, is the constraints on UNRWA are much stronger than they are on the Jeffra Foundation, for instance. I remember an activist within the camp asked like a handful of us to go and ask UNRWA to get food in from a different area because one of the main regime checkpoints had been closed. But by policy, they aren't able to do all of these things. They're very constricted. And the safety of their employees, understandably, is always a
They
priority.
can't circumvent the regime because then they'd be kicked out or attacked.
Yeah, exactly. And they always have to emphasize that they tend not to engage in too much work that's too risky for their people. Of course, they make huge sacrifices, as do their employees. I don't want to take away from that. But the Jeffra Foundation, for instance, because it's comprised of Palestinians from Yarmouk or from Syria, have been bolder in their approaches and have been more successful. If anyone's interested in donating, Jeffra doesn't have like a nice page or anything, but you can easily get in contact with one of their founders. I'll happily put you in touch with them, give you their email, and then you can communicate with them and see how you can help, what manner you'd like to help, if there's a specific thing you'd like to offer, or if you'd like to do fundraising. I hope I answered your question. Go ahead.
Can you comment on the recent visit of Palestinian authorities to Damascus and their talks, and how is that reflected in Yarmouk? I mean, amongst the people there who live there.
Okay, I'll tell you, I've just spoken a lot about how we need to talk about the regime, and we do. But the first thing I hear almost across the board, even for people who are against the opposition, like regardless of your political background, when I'm like, who do you blame the most? Not in terms of like immediate accountability, but who do you blame the most? Always the answer is the Palestinian factions. الفصائل الفلسطينية. Always. I mean, in my opinion, these factions, this is more personal, are useless, and that has been made extremely evident by what has happened. Go ahead.
This is just a personal question. So I get a huge paradox when I read or I hear the capital of the Palestinian diaspora. In particular, that word diaspora. I hang on that word diaspora because when was it first popularized? It was popularized during the Jewish diaspora. So how do I cope with this kind of paradox that we call Yarmouk the capital of the Amber Alert? Or no, weather alert? Flash flood. So my question is, how do I respond to this paradox of the term diaspora when it was first popularized during the Jewish diaspora?
That's a much broader question that I think all Palestinians struggle with. I'm really against drawing parallels between what is happening to us with what happened to the Jewish community.
Right.
But it's certainly an interesting one that I certainly don't have the time or haven't given enough consideration to answer right now.
Okay.
But it's certainly fascinating.
Okay.
This is a more basic question, but how long, on average, people in Yarmouk have they spent at Yarmouk? It's like a lot of people there home for a very long time.
Can you repeat his question?
Yeah. So how long has, on average, a lot of people in Yarmouk, how long have they been inhabitants of the Yarmouk camp?
Obviously it varies, but most people, that's their home. That's their life. And until now, when they've experienced another dispossession.
How's the situation in the other refugee camps in Syria?
That's a whole other talk. Daraa camp is tattered. Hanashef is gone. All of these places have been completely destroyed. But it's very specific case by case. There are over 12 Palestinian refugee camps in Syria. And you'll find that in some of them, it has more to, in some of them, the opposition has a larger share of the blame.
So we're seeing similar trends in those camps?
Not nearly as bad. Not nearly as bad. And that has to do with a lot of very intricate detail. But also, this was the largest Palestinian camp. And its position right next to Damascus means that not only will it get more attention from the world, but it will get more attention from various factions, oppositional and pro-regime. But if feel free to email me and I can link you to places that go into detail about all of them. I mean, all of these things have been cataloged. There is no real ambiguity surrounding this.
How do you compare Yarmouk now to Palestine in this area?
Yeah, that's a very great comparison that a lot of people make. For me, to put it simply, this is an extension of the Assad dynasty's complete indifference towards Palestinian life. And this is crucial as Palestinians. I mean, our people are used as a prop by someone who is a brutal dictator and slaughtering people. As Palestinians, even if you want to say Syria has nothing to do with us, it is our obligation at least to step up and say, no, wait, this isn't the vanguard of resistance. This isn't my resistance. And the great line that used to be used is that I refuse to return, I'm paraphrasing from Arabic, I refuse the road to Jerusalem if it's paved in the blood of Syrian children. Our liberation is very important, of course, but not through the oppression of someone else, not through the slaughter of other people. But yeah, the comparison there's a lot that's been written about that. It's very interesting.
One question I had is going off of that. What would you say that, like, my family's from Nahar al-Bared, which is a refugee camp in Lebanon, so I don't know if you know what happened there. It got totally destroyed by the Lebanese army in 2007. And like, what would you say to like people living there and like us here and like other refugee camps where they might not be as bad as Yarmouk, but like they don't have like proper citizenship and human rights. So what can we do to like raise more awareness about it and like press more for the government? Because they don't have citizenship, which hinders them from starting jobs and just life.
It's hard in Lebanon. I grew up in Lebanon. I mean, me with all my privilege and my American passport, I entered the airport in Lebanon. And he's like, Aslat min wain, where are you from originally? And the minute I say Palestinian, the face changes. That's for me. That's for me with my hair and my like Western, it's for me. For the people in the refugee camps there, you can't even compare. And this has been a constant feature. And so I think the larger point of all of this, I mean, not for me, but I guess it should be considered, is that we can't forget about the refugees. It's easy to sloganize right of return. It's easy to be like, no, we will return, and I'm going to get back to my grandfather's land and grow olive trees, and that's great, and it's important. But there are segments of us in the diaspora that are in positions constantly being tormented, constantly being dead. In Lebanon, you can't work, you can't live, you can't leave. It's not a life, it's not an existence. And so, I mean, hopefully, if we can start talking about Yarmouk, we can also start talking about the other refugee camps. We need to. These are our people. Like they were saying about not wanting to return. I want to return just as much as the next person, but I want to return with these people. I want to return with these people tattered in the refugee camps in Lebanon. The people who stayed in Yarmouk and were like, you know what? Cut off everything, we're going to stay. And that's what they're saying. And we can't neglect them. We really can't neglect them.
So you have spoken about how sometimes the news of Yarmouk pop up.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of months of silence, and then Yarmouk comes up and in the headlines, and then silence, and then the cycle goes on. And you have spoken as well about you as an activist being in contact with other activists inside the Yarmouk camp. So the way I can see it is that you have the means and you have the technology. They have the stories and they have the information. My question is, how can we reach to a point where these two things can be combined so that Yarmouk doesn't become just a headline every other month? And if you can give me examples of maybe previous work that has been done about this, or maybe plans that, because personally, what I'm seeing is all talk, to be honest. Like, we're saying that we need to talk about Palestinians, we need to do this, we need to do that, and it's all been talk. I mean, there is, in my opinion, there is single initiative that has really worked to make the idea or the story of Yarmouk there all the time. The Holocaust have been, the so-called Holocaust happened or took place years before, and still, whenever we see pictures, whenever we see anything, we're shocked. This, Yarmouk, is becoming a normal thing. Not only Yarmouk, Gaza, Yemen, Syria, Egypt, everywhere, it's becoming normal. So the idea is, how can we reach a point where this does not become normal?
I mean, that's hard for anyone, I think, especially as Arabs or really anyone from certain backgrounds, you become desensitized. Like, it's inevitable, kind of. But I think one productive and successful response is to highlight the life, this is a terrible cliche platitude, but the life that continues to exist. There's a man in Yarmouk who still till today goes around and plays on his piano. How beautiful is that? You know what, when I see that, it breaks my heart more than these pictures, as heartbreaking as these pictures are. The fact is, though, and you're right, now there's a lot of talk of silence in Yarmouk, but this is all new. There's been an extended period where no one was talking about it, and the fact is that there were a lot of initiatives from the camp. Let Us Live campaign, Now Yarmouk Will Not Fall campaign. These are all coming from the camp. But we can't amplify that if we don't reach some kind of consensus about it, or at least a partial political consensus on it. I mean, if we're still at the stage now where we're like, oh, who's to blame? All sides are bad. Of course we can't do work and go and work with them. Of course we can't take it further into the next step. But you're right in that now we've reached a period with ISIS where people are finally talking about it. My fear, I stay up at nights about this, is that the same thing that happened last January, where people begin to talk about it for a couple of weeks and then it disappears, is going to happen again. So I don't know, but this is where we all come together. I wrote a piece where I was like, I don't have, also I'm not an activist, by the way, just so you know. Where I said, I don't have the answers, I'm not on a pedestal. I mean, I'm elevated now, but I'm not on a pedestal. I'm not better than anyone else by any means. I have so many shortcomings with this, and I've made so many mistakes with what I've tried to do with Yarmouk. But the fact of the matter is, the first step to any kind of work is for us to have a conversation. And for us to have the conversation, we need to acknowledge it. You know what I mean? But that's where all these active and beautiful people in the crowd come in. Better at brainstorming and organizing and coming up with creative approaches than I am.
The pieces that you've personally written, have you seen, how far of a reach have you seen leadership? I guess you must be attracted to that as well. Do you see it only amongst the Palestinian community? Do you see people outside of the Palestinian community carrying sort of?
I mean, yes and no. I think what she pointed out is very true, is that occasionally there are spikes of interest and then that dissolves. But you asked me, I'm not interested in my work. I think I've made a lot of mistakes in my approach, where maybe I've been too aggressive, or I've berated too many people, or I've seemed too morally righteous. But again, it's a learning process for all of us. And we all, I think, need to reach a point where we say, okay, let's really come together now that we're finally talking about it and do something. And again, that doesn't mean we're going to resolve it. I don't think we can necessarily. But if it can become clear to the people in the camp that we're thinking about them, that we're having protests for them, that we're discussing it, that we're just watching, then that symbolically will have huge beneficial implications.
As you rightfully said, there's an open war in all of Syria, and everyone is involved in it for various reasons. My question is, first of all, I don't think what's happening in Syria is going to end anytime soon. I hope it does, but it won't, to be realistic. So, with your connections in Yarmouk, do you see that there's any way possible, from a humanitarian perspective, to isolate the camp from what's happening in Syria?
We can try. I mean, there are constantly calls about neutralizing the camp, especially now. And there have been 3 attempts at truces. I don't know. I don't know. Given our history, if history is any guide, it's not. It doesn't look optimistic. And the fact of the matter is so much has already been lost for Palestinians in Syria. So much has been destroyed. This Yarmouk, what you see now, are people's homes. The same way that those of us who are Palestinians had grandfathers who had villages. It's that much of a loss. So I don't know that even they would be able to just let this go. In terms of neutralizing the camp, I hope, and we try. There are a lot of people trying a lot of different things on different levels politically to make that happen. Whether or not it happens, I'm not sure, but I think we owe it to them to engage in this and to involve ourselves and to amplify their voices, you know?
I have to say though, I don't think it's ever possible because our fates are inseparable. We have, not in like the Western analysts, Arabs are all a monolith, and not in the SSNP sense, but no, we are all in this, and you know, it started in Syria, but Lebanese, Palestinians, Syrians are all involved, and it has repercussions everywhere, and I think it's very hard to, you know, it's very important to talk about Yarmouk and highlight it and say, because it is, people call it a divisive issue, but it is very important to not lose sight of what's happening in Syria and what's happening to Palestinians and Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and how that situation is being played out in Lebanon, as if, you know, Syria just should be, you know, locking the borders and shutting it out and isolating ourselves. We're from Lebanon, and you know, this is why we're here today, because we know that our fates are inseparable, and you can't isolate one thing from the other.
Sure. No, I mean, I agree with you 100%. You know what I mean? Like, again, another platitude. We have to stand together. Those are like, it's what's really heartbreaking for me to see is so many Syrians who I've seen before all of this be involved and passionate about Palestine stuff, to now kind of turn to the Palestinian community, which is better organized and more established, and be like, hey, can you help us? And to have the response be so muted. I think what you're saying is very true. Nice joke about SSNP, but I think it's completely true, is that all of our fates are linked to some extent or another. And we have to, I mean, we really have to rid ourselves of this notion that of this old Arab left idea of, like, you know, compromise and lesser of two evils and all of these things that really led us to where we are today. No, I reject oppression in Palestine, and I reject it in Syria, and I reject it wherever it exists. So yeah, your point is very well taken, and I think you made it quite eloquently. It's absolutely our fates are linked.
Actually, I have a question. So you did a really great job of going over kind of a bird's eye view of what happened to Yarmouk. What's really, I think, hit home for me is reading personal accounts. There's some that I just can't shake off.
Yeah.
Can you share with us a personal story from Yarmouk that maybe has affected you, that you know, there's a ton of stories out of Syria. Some never leave us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to answer that question in a weird way. There's a person who I continue to correspond with, who it's relatively prominent within the camp. And what breaks my heart is that every time I speak to this person, and I speak with them weekly, if not more frequently than that, every time they are grateful. They thank me. That's so mind-blowing for me, that someone who is living the conditions they live in can express gratitude. Why would they ever do that? I mentioned that story because that is what always affects me the most. Is that this segment of Palestinian population, I'm sure you've experienced it with the Syrian population, still has an affinity towards us after all of our neglect, and after the so many ways that we've wronged them. In terms of more personal stories, I mean, there are a lot of accounts actually in English of direct, like I try to avoid paraphrasing other people's words unless I have to, because I do it sometimes. But I really encourage people to reach out to people within the camp. You can communicate with them. listen for yourself and hear their stories. They're so eager to speak with someone. I'm not a prominent writer or anything like that, but they speak to me because no one else is reaching out. Speak to them. If all you want to do is touch base with someone within the camp every week and tell them, I love you, right? I love you, I'm thinking about you. I'm worried about you. That goes such a long way. And I think I do their stories a disservice by repeating them now. I really encourage everyone here to go out and hear them firsthand. They're heartbreaking, but they can be uplifting too. And not in a corny kind of resistance way, but wow, life can be so resilient under such grim conditions.
So you mentioned to reach out to camps. How do you go about doing that?
I mentioned earlier, if anyone wants to shoot me an email, right now I'll give them my email. We could put you in touch with people. Or, right now there's some stuff going on with ISIS. So it becomes harder, but you can still reach out. So my short answer is I'll gladly put you in touch with someone. If you speak Arabic, sorry.
Okay, last call for questions. Okay, thank you so much, Talal, for joining us.